Hey, welcome everyone. I have a very special guest today on a book that I wanted to, actually, two books that I want to interview this doctor, Dr. James Nicolantonio. So, welcome,
Thanks for
doctor.
having me on, Dr. Berg. Appreciate it.
Absolutely. I'm guessing that's an Italian name, right?
Yes, it is indeed.
Just a wild guess. So, listen, I want to just dive right in. You wrote a very fascinating book, actually, two. I want to cover the first one first, called The Salt Fix. And that's such a confusing topic to so many people, and there's a lot of false information. So I want to pick your brain, if you don't mind, and get some data on this. We've all been told that salt is bad for us, and it causes high blood pressure, et cetera, et cetera. Give us some basics on what you found with salt.
Sure. Well, I think even back from an evolutionary perspective, in the book I talk about this, we've had this preconceived notion that our ancestors ate this very low salt diet. These are based on calculations, simply looking at land muscle meat, so not aquatic vegetation or aquatic animals, and not nose to tail, where we would have consumed the salty blood and interstitial fluid, but simply looking at a piece of meat. And so those calculations had put our Paleolithic ancestors at consuming about 500 milligrams of sodium per day. But if you look at it from the perspective of consuming nose to tail, and the fact that we would actually follow animals to salt licks and we could consume salt directly, that's just a complete falsehood and a very low estimation of how much salt we would have consumed. So, yeah, you had a question
I
potentially?
was just going to say, like, I think what we're told is a certain amount. Like, how much? What, from your viewpoint, what is the recommended amount of salt? I guess we can do it in teaspoons. It'd be easier, or a half a teaspoon or teaspoon.
Well, so the American Heart Association essentially recommends less than a half of a teaspoon of salt per day. However, they also recommend that we should be exercising an hour per day. And we actually lose about a half a teaspoon of salt per hour of exercise through sweat. And then you have the US dietary guidelines that recommend less than a teaspoon of salt per day.
Wow.
Now, from actually all the prospective studies, the lowest risk of death or heart attacks is actually at consuming about 1.5 teaspoons of salt per day, or about 3.4 grams of sodium is essentially where the lowest rates of mortality, cardiovascular disease, things like that actually sit.
Hmm. And not to mention, the other big recommendation is to drink a ton of water, right? You start drinking more water, you have low salt, then you develop hyponatremia, and
Yep,
you have a whole series of issues with that alone, especially
correct.
if you're exercising and sweating.
Right. And I mean, most of us too are consuming caffeine. And I didn't realize up until a couple of years ago how actually caffeine, the reason why it causes diuresis is because it causes us to lose sodium and chloride. So it causes natriuresis. So the typical loss of sodium from 4 cups of coffee is half a teaspoon of salt, or about 1,200 milligrams of sodium.
Wow, I didn't know that. That's fascinating.
So, all of us are our Java junkies now, are consuming caffeinated sports beverages, and that is slowly depleting you of both sodium and actually even more chloride. For some reason, caffeine in coffee is a tremendous chloride waster, about even 2 times higher than the amount of sodium we lose. So, the typical athlete, who sweats, half a teaspoon of salt out per hour, they're also losing iodine too through sweat. So you typically lose about 50 to 100 micrograms of iodine per hour of exercise. And so if you're constantly sweating out salt and iodine and you're never replacing those things, that can lead to hypothyroidism, low salt, hyponatremia, poor exercise tolerance.
Wow. Now, if you're, let's say you're a football player and it's summer and you're in practice, I've heard that if you're doing some type of intense exercise, you could lose up to 6 grams of salt or at least sodium per I guess workout. That's like an ungodly amount of loss of
Yeah.
electrolyte.
That's true. So in the salt fix, I actually do cite one study. It was soccer players in practice in the
Mm,
heat, and the goal, I believe it was the goalie, lost 6,000 milligrams of sodium in the 1 hour of practice, and I think the average loss was about 1,800 milligrams of sodium per hour. But certain individuals can lose, 6 grams or 6,000 milligrams, excuse me, 6 grams of sodium.
wow. Now, as far as what people should be eating, let's say they're concerned about, well, their doctor said there's certain studies. What does the actual, now you mentioned the studies that say, well, if you consume at 1.5 teaspoons, then you start to have issues. Is that true or just incomplete data?
I think so. We have to look at salt, which is sodium and chloride, from the perspective of overall dietary intake.
Right.
Because if you consume a good amount of potassium, bicarbonate, fruits, vegetables, citrates, things that are increasing your alkalinity, you can handle and tolerate much higher levels of salt. So
That's what I was gonna bring up. Yeah.
it's so people that are salt sensitive typically are either insulin resistant, and you fix their high insulin levels, and they're no longer salt sensitive. So it's really they're sugar sensitive in a way, these people. It's just showing up as salt sensitivity. Or you increase their potassium, magnesium, and bicarbonate forming substances, either potassium citrate or bicarbonate, and you're going to be able to virtually eliminate salt sensitivity in probably 99% of people.
That's just a point that I want to bring up because I found that the great majority of the population have no idea that the quantity of potassium that they need, so they're usually going to be underdoing it, especially if they're, an average American consumes like 1.5 cups of greens. And so now we're going to get low potassium. Now you're going to have more tendency to be more sensitive to sodium just because that ratio is not there. So you can't buffer it. Um, so I guess they didn't they didn't talk about that or study that variable with people. I don't know if they looked at the potassium levels when they checked the sensitivity to salt at all. Maybe they didn't. I don't know.
Right. And well, that's the thing. And it's very difficult to actually find studies testing this out. And I do mention a couple in the Sulfix where they actually took these high salt consuming Japanese people who had high blood pressure. They were consuming 15 grams of salt, so about twice what we typically consume. Or most people only consume about 8 grams of salt per day in the United States. And they decided to raise their potassium intake from 3 grams to 7 grams. And they kept the high salt intake the same. And it significantly reduced blood pressure, essentially to a normotensive state or normal blood pressure. So it goes to show you you can consume a very high salt diet as long as you get the potassium level fairly high.
Got it. Um, now, as far as what you recommend that an average consumer should consume, how much salt should they be consuming?
If someone is eating a whole food diet, right, so they're not consuming these high refined carbs and sugars, then really that 1.5 teaspoons is perfect for someone. Because when you start going below 3 grams of sodium, you start to see the increases in the sodium retaining stress hormones, aldosterone, renin, angiotensin 2. That is indicating that your body is in a stressed out state to retain the salt. And so you always want to keep the body in homeostasis. And that starts to separate from homeostasis as soon as you go below 3 grams of sodium per day.
So brings up an interesting point. You're saying or talking about if someone's not consuming enough salt, the body can then start stressing out and activating more adrenal hormones and other hormones, right?
Correct. Right. And even in animal studies, this is really interesting. If you put them on a low salt diet, they have to continuously secrete the sodium retaining hormone called aldosterone. And that has been shown to lead to hypertrophy of the adrenal glands. And that can lead to adrenal fatigue. But it's physiologically, you can see it on a hypertrophied adrenal gland from a low salt diet. So you can see that this would play out in humans as well. If you're constantly pushing out 10 times the amount of aldosterone because you're on a low salt diet, that can potentially hypertrophy the adrenal glands and lead to adrenal burnout.
Wow. Is there any data that shows that doing a low sodium diet can trigger increased cortisol?
That's a good question. I don't know. Not sure, but I would assume that it would because you are stressing the body out, and cortisol helps retain salt a little bit, but it's what I call it the sodium releaser in the body. If you are stressed out and you're trying to run away from a lion, the cortisol helps the body to release the sodium, increase blood volume so you can run longer.
In-
Where aldosterone is the salt storer, so it helps you store.
right. Now, when someone has a condition where they're completely shot, their adrenals are shot, and they have the condition called Addison's, where they don't have any more adrenal function, then they have to consume salt like 24/7, right? Because they have a hole in the bucket. There's no retention of that salt.
Right. I actually in the salt fix, I have this unique story. It was a child that was constantly raiding the kitchen cabinet and just consuming just ungodly amounts of salt. And the mother was obviously concerned, and they hospitalized this child, not realizing that the child had salt wasting kidney disease, and the child ended up dying because they essentially restrained the child on the bed from being able to go and get the salt that his body was telling him he needed. And so, right, you're correct. When you start losing the cortisol and the adrenal hormone functions, then you're going to start wasting more salt.
Yeah, interesting. Um, what about you mentioned this briefly. I want to know a little bit more about insulin resistance. So you take a typical person who's insulin resistant, they want to get on keto. If you're insulin resistant, um, do you have a problem retaining salt, or you just can't absorb it, or what happens?
So typically, if you haven't damaged the kidneys, which can cause salt wasting, and you're sort of maybe early on or middle stage in your insulin resistance, it's causing you to over retain salt. And
Okay.
essentially, that's because as insulin levels increase, it tells the kidneys to hold on to more sodium. So as soon as you drop the high refined carbohydrate intake and lower the insulin levels, your kidneys will then start flushing yourself out of salt. And typically most salt sensitive people become fixed once they do that.
This is why you see diabetics have these swollen ankles, and they're just filled with fluid like crazy.
Right.
They're just holding. They're like a waterlog, basically.
They are waterlogged, and it's also due to the elevation in glucose, because glucose also has an osmotic effect as well, like sodium. It pulls fluid out of the cell and into the plasma volume.
So we have that effect, and then we also have the storage of glucose as glycogen. You store 3 molecules of fluid or water for every 1 molecule of glycogen. So there's a lot of different dynamics happening that you're holding fluid. So that's
Mhm.
fascinating.
Yeah.
As far as the quality of um, salt, what type of salt do you recommend? Of course, I'm guessing it's not going to be table salt.
Yeah, I mean, I do appreciate the pink salts
Yeah.
because they contain natural iodine. So the biggest question I get is if someone purchases a pink salt, it'll say not a good source of iodide, DE. And that's because they're not artificially adding iodide to the salt. It just naturally contains iodine. So the FDA makes them state that it is not a good source of iodide. But your pink salts do contain natural amounts of iodine in fairly clinically significant amounts. So I like either the original Himalayan pink salt, which seems to have about 25 micrograms of iodine per 10 grams of salt, and Redmond real salt, which their mineral analysis indicates 170 micrograms of iodine per 10 grams of salt. So depending on if you are sweating a lot and if you're not getting a lot of iodine in the diet, maybe Redmond is a better salt for you. If you are someone who already gets a lot of iodine, you're eating a lot of pastured eggs, you're drinking dairy, milk, or eating cheese, and you're not sweating a whole lot, maybe a lower iodine salt, Pink's Himalayan salt, would be better.
Interesting. Um, if someone's going to do a ketogenic diet and they want to consume a 1.5 teaspoons, and they're sprinkling on their food, but then they're short. So do you recommend just putting some salt in some water, dissolving it and drinking it, or how would you recommend to consume that salt?
It depends on the person. I've noticed that some people like to take salt straight and then wash fluid down, whereas some other people like to take it as a shot, where they'll put a little bit of lemon juice, a little bit of water, maybe just 1 ounce, and just take it like a quick shot. It really depends on the person. And I think, it also depends on your activity level too, because if you're someone who works out intensely for an hour per day, you probably want to get a half a teaspoon of salt in you, 60 minutes before the workout to boost blood volume, boost performance, reduce hyponatremia.
Interesting. When someone goes on a ketogenic diet and they lose all this fluid and they don't take enough salt, what are some of the top symptoms that they're going to get?
It's a good question. Based on the clinical studies, we know that it leads to sleep disturbance, fatigue, and erectile dysfunction. Based on actual people that I've talked to, um, the most emails that I've gotten, like a couple hundred emails, have been people that have had AFib and just added back salt and it instantly went away their atrial fibrillation. I've gotten the most emails about that. So I'm not saying that that can do that for your individual case, but for some reason, salt is obviously is important for conductivity, electrical impulses. That seems to be a big driver, and it could be due to the fact that salt controls magnesium. When you don't get enough salt, you start to pull sodium, but also magnesium and calcium from the bone, and that can lead to negative magnesium and calcium balance if you're low in salt. And so simply adding the salt back can also fix magnesium deficiency if you're pulling it from the bone. And then muscle cramps, exercise intolerance are very common symptoms, but dizziness going from a seated to a standing position as well is very common. And then muscle cramps too.
Hmm. Yes, I've noticed just from also talking with like hundreds of people, uh, muscle weakness. You feel weaker. I guess that would be kind of a fatigue, but you feel kind of weak, and then you take salt and just kind of come right up. You feel stronger. Obviously, you need. I mean, in all your cells, you have not only the sodium potassium pump, but you have sodium interaction between your nervous system and the muscles. I mean, it's a required electrolyte, obviously.
Yes.
And so,
Yeah, sodium allows you to pull glucose into the cell, amino acids into the cell. It allows you to get acid out of the cell. It allows almost every single neurotransmitter to be moved in and out of the cells of the brain. It
mhm.
allows you to absorb vitamin C and put vitamin C into the brain, into the adrenal glands, into the bone. You can actually induce osteoporosis in animals by simply lowering their sodium level in the blood, preventing vitamin C from getting into the bone. So it's really interesting. Sodium is the universal molecule that is used to move almost any single substance in the body.
Fascinating. Now let's switch to chlorides. So you get sodium chloride. Um, as far as building up your stomach acids, for example, making hydrochloric acid, if you're low on chlorides, what type of problems could occur?
Almost any nutrient deficiency would happen then because you need that stomach acid in order to digest your food and then in order to absorb nutrients. So you can see things like small intestinal bacterial overgrowth or a lot of bloating if you don't have good stomach acid, which could be due to a low salt intake. And this has actually been tested out in studies. People have gone from a normal salt intake to a low salt intake, and it significantly reduces the acid in the stomach and raises the pH of the stomach. So it's important to keep a very acidic stomach, and you cannot make chloride. We can't synthesize it. You have to get it by eating salt.
Fascinating. That's awesome.
Mhm.
Well, that's awesome. So let's switch to your other book that actually was co-authored by Sim Land, which he came to my summit the last year. It's called The Immune Fix. So tell us a little bit about that book in very simple layman's terms. I know you're giving a lot of natural things, but give us a little bit more data on that book.
So the immunity fix was born out by some of my publications in the academic literature. I was trying to figure out what potential nutraceutical strategies may help against RNA viruses, including coronavirus. And we actually published probably the first review paper in February. It was press released by Elsevier on this potential strategy. And then I said, I need to really turn this into a book because nobody reads academic literature. And it ended up turning into this 2,500 referenced sort of like Bible on immunity. But in essence, and we're really not being told this, by the common press, is that you are in control of your own immune health and how healthy you are metabolically and how your nutrition status is can directly determine how well you can fight off viruses. And I'll give you a really great example of this. There's a virus, an RNA virus called Coxsackie-virus. And in some kids, it causes hand, foot, and mouth. And in most people, it doesn't cause anything. You don't even know you have it. But if you're deficient in just one mineral, selenium, it causes Keyshawn disease, which leads to cardiomyopathy and death. And you treat those people who have this RNA viral infection that are dying by simply giving them selenium, because selenium is important for your antioxidant status, right? Increasing glutathione, making thyroid hormones. So it goes to show you that your resilience, which depends on your metabolic health and your nutrient status, directly determines how well you are going to handle any type of virus.
The elephant in the room is that there's a huge, huge omission with this whole COVID situation going on. It's like there's no real focus on building up your own immune system, which is ultimately your greatest protection. Instead, it's all about avoiding this pathogen and trying to stay clean and be sterile. But it's a huge missing thing, and I know in your book that you go into major details. So this book is also really good for people that are under want to know all the details. Um, I mean, your immune system also needs salt and chlorides as they use that as part of their weapons to kill off certain things. And so you cover that in great depth. One quick question about viruses in general. In your book, you get a lot more into it, but what are like maybe the top nutrient that someone needs to focus on more if they're concerned about a weak immune system and viral protection?
I would say the two nutrients, because they're very highly linked, is magnesium and vitamin D. And so you have 1 billion people globally that are vitamin D deficient, and half the global population is vitamin D insufficient. So, and that increases, if you are severely D deficient, that increases your risk of dying from COVID-19 by 15-fold. And you can't change how old you are, but you can certainly fix your vitamin D levels. And then magnesium is required to activate vitamin D in the body via these hydroxylase enzymes. And about 50% of the US population is deficient in magnesium. So taking those two together are very important for maintaining a healthy immune system.
See, I thought you were going to say zinc, but when you said magnesium, you're telling me that which makes sense. Magnesium is required for vitamin D. So without vitamin D, it boils down. That's like your weak thing. So if you're low on magnesium, the vitamin D really won't work that well. So
Right.
all. So I think what you're saying is like vitamin D is like the pinnacle, the most important thing because it's like the immune modulator.
Well, right. And you have these vitamin D receptors on almost all of your immune cells. And in order to activate those, you have to form the active hormone called calcitriol. And once calcitriol binds to those receptors, you can you fix sort of like these overactive inflammation when you do that. But in order to get the calcitriol, you need the magnesium to convert D to the active hormone.
What about some of the worst foods that someone should avoid for their immune system?
Probably the worst would be the omega-6 seed oils. And not only from the fact that they're highly oxidized and you form more oxidation products in the acidity of your stomach when you consume these oils, which is very damaging to the gut. And then you don't absorb nutrients once you damage the gut. But the fact that omega-6 will actually get into almost every single immune cell. And once you start saturating your immune cells with omega-6, they start producing more pro-inflammatory cytokines. So that would be the number one thing to avoid is the corn oil, right? Safflower, soybean oils that a lot of people are cooking with.
Fascinating. And then, of course, then on the flip side, maybe omega-3 would be good to take as well.
Right. Yeah. So many people are deficient in omega 3s, and that helps to form these, pro-resolvins that help resolve. Literally, this is how our body resolves inflammation: is utilizing things like EPA and DHA and forming these substances called
Mhm.
resolvins and protectants. And it's essentially how our body heals from inflammation.
Well, this has been an incredible interview. Everyone's going to love this data. I put both of your links down below for both of your books, and I highly suggest you guys get these two books. They're fascinating. One is called The Salt Fix, and the other one is called The Immunity Fix, because it's all about just gaining knowledge to not just about treating symptoms, but getting to the core, getting to the cause. So thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me on.